Morning, Shavua Tov. It's so sweet to be here. This is one of my favorite topics. And I really want to say that you don't have to be, you don't have to aspire necessarily or have planned when you're going to be the next, what we call darshan, Devar Torah giver, a darshan. It's just wonderful to understand from a Jewish perspective how over hundreds of years we have as a people assembled Torah and how we have worked together to kind of create a series of styles by which or through which we can continue that chain of tradition of sharing Torah in a meaningful and inspiring way. Boker Tov, Janice, great to have you. I'm so glad you're here. All right, I am going to share my screen. You guys know how this goes. All right, share. Perfect. Okay, can I get a thumbs up if you guys can see? Awesome, great. Okay.
Jenny, will you share this with us, like in an email later? So we don't have to try to, okay.
Yes. In fact, what I'm going to do is when we're all done, I'll put both documents that I'm working with in the chat. You can get them that way. I can also email them to you so that you have all of this. Okay, so how many of you were at Rabbi Eric's Devar Torah workshop? And it doesn't matter at all. Oh, okay, everyone but said, perfect. So Rabbi Eric and I certainly have a similar style in many ways because, well, first of all, we went through the same training, but and had some similar mentors. But additionally, in many ways, Rabbi Eric was my mentor. He landed as a rabbi several years before me. And so a lot of my learning is from him. We did not put our workshops together in consultation with one another, but we did share what afterwards, after we put it together, what we're going to share. So hopefully this will be some reinforcement of what he shared in his own voice, in his own way. As well as my personal take on how I like to do things. So I wanted to give a very simple structure that I use that I hope will be helpful. Secondarily, we're going to look at an essay together that after 20 years, this essay was published in 1993. That's not when I first read it, but it's been around for a long time, that I still think is the best written article on how to write a Devar Torah. Right, Brian is joining us, Brian Oral, fantastic. And then I'm going to share some of my favorite online resources. So hopefully, those are going to be our three parts. We'll do a basic structure. I'm going to share my favorite essay, which will break down together on giving a Devar Torah. And then we're going to look at my favorite online resources. All right. I see Brian Oral has joined us. Bonnie Leach has joined us. Fantastic. I'm so glad you're here. I smile every time I see Bonnie's Hebrew name, Brina, or Yiddish name pop up on her naming on her Zoom screen. I love that. Okay. So here's what I always use as a basic structure. Always begin with a greeting. That sounds kind of obvious, but sometimes in the excitement of what you want to share, you might forget. And it's a beautiful way just to situate, give people a beat to take a breath from whatever we've transitioned from. So usually if you're giving a Devar Torah on Shabbat, it would be traditional to say Shabbat Shalom. If it's a holiday, you could say Chag Sameach. If it is the new month, you could say Chodesh Tov. So whatever is this moment in time, it's a way of situating ourselves before you jump right in. The second thing is if you're using the Torah portion And you don't necessarily have to use the Torah portion. Sometimes we use a Jewish idea that's more in connection with the moment in time, more in a grander way, whether it's a holiday or it's the new moon, something like that, or a season. But if you're going to use the Torah portion, it's nice to do a very short introduction of the Torah portion. Now, I will say this is a part where people often get derailed. Many people think that if you are about to share something about the Torah from this week's Torah portion, that you need to give a very detailed overview of the Torah portion. That is a mistake, in my humble opinion. We don't need to get a full review of the Torah portion. There is far too much in any given Torah portion to give a whole review. You lose people and it really takes away from whatever you want to teach. So you need to give people a little bit of context, because not everybody will have read the Torah portion. Not everybody knows where we left off last week or where we are in the larger narrative. But please do not make the mistake of feeling that you need to review the entire Torah portion. I would say 1, 2, maximum 3 pieces of context to understand where we are is a great beginning. Any questions so far? Okay. So the third point that I like to go is to zoom in on your question, your focus, or what we call, and I'm sure Rabbi Eric talked about that, your koshi. A koshi in Hebrew is a difficulty. So a lot of times, and it's not the only way to do a Devar Torah, but a lot of times we begin a Devar Torah with a koshi. That's a very traditional methodology. A question, something that's difficult in the text. It could be difficult theologically. It could be difficult grammatically. It could be difficult, just in terms of your understanding of human nature. There's so many little difficulties that we could pick on. Some are more literary, like, oh, this word is repeated 5 times in a relatively short span of text. Or this text seems to contradict something we learned earlier or something we're going to see later. So there's all different ways that you could think about a koshi or a question, but that's what we use to focus our attention. And again, I'm going to repeat, many people make the mistake of coming into a Devar Torah with more than one koshi. It's too much. And this is the great thing about Torah, is that it just keeps going. So you don't have to share every single difficulty about this Torah portion, because please God, it will come again next year and we will be around to see it. Okay, so just identify one. All right. Once you've identified your question, your koshi, your curiosity, your difficulty, it's traditional to share a couple other commentaries. What have Jews in the past, whether they are from the medieval period, from the ancient rabbinic period, from modern contemporary period, from your neighbor, what have other Jews said in conversation about your particular focus? Now I'll say it again. People make the mistake of bringing 10 commentaries on your particular difficulty. It's too much. It becomes confusing, and I would say a less is more approach is what you want to think about at each stage. So context, less is more. Identifying your koshi, less is more. Bringing commentaries, less is more. The more you can focus, actually, the more you give people to take away, because we can really delve into the complexity of one thing. It's so rich. And that's what makes our Torah, I think, incredibly beautiful. Once you've shared a couple of commentaries, what other Jews have said about your particular koshi is what I call the mic drop. Okay, this is your moment to share what you think, How does this resonate in your life experience, the way you see the world? What difference does this Torah make in our lives more broadly? And how could we translate this Torah into wisdom for our lives? And I think it's really important, when when Rabbi Eric and I bring a text, for example, on Shabbat morning, we each have our own kind of mic drop. We have something in mind that feels important that we want to share. At the same time, we have some very focused question or questions that we're going to put out there to cultivate the wisdom of those who are present. So it's not that we could never possibly anticipate what everybody is going to contribute. But we want to create space for that. But we don't ever come and say like, this question is really exciting to me. These are some commentaries. Now, what do you think? And not have any ideas of our own. Now, it may be that other folks there share from their own wisdom, something we had planned to share. But we always come in with something personal, some point that we feel compelled to make. So it is both an opening to invite others to share with no expectation for what that would be, but also something that feels really important and personal in terms of what this Torah, how this Torah impacts our own lives. Now, as you all know, because you're regulars, you know the way that we do a Devar Torah on Shabbat morning, we invite people to join in. That's one style. You absolutely never need to do that. You can always just offer a piece of Torah. And sometimes like at a meeting or something like that, if we open with a Devar Torah, we don't do a full kind of Torah exploration together. So inviting commentary from those who are present is obviously optional, depending on your preference and depending on the context. Okay, I'm going to pause there and take any questions about this basic structure, which is what I use every time. Anyone? Oh, yes, Robin.
Hi, Rabbi Jenny. My question is, should there be a guideline of about the amount of time one should look toward? In other, public speaking and teaching things that I do, I know my audience. And so I know when I need to be brief and when I can expand a bit. Do we have a loose guideline for that?
Fantastic. So I love two things I heard you say, which I think absolutely apply. Knowing your people, having a sense for who's here and how this typically goes, and having a feel for context. So for example, if you're giving a Devar Torah at the opening of a meeting, 2 to 3 minutes. If you're giving a Devar Torah in a Shabbat morning service where you're not inviting participation, 10 minutes. If you're inviting participation, maybe 20 minutes. And I'll go back to the less is more. Nobody ever complains about a Devar Torah being too short. When it drags on and you start to lose people, that is a pitfall. So again, as you're thinking about the context, always err on the side of less, because what you're doing is giving people more. Is that helpful?
Yes.
Okay, great. Other questions about this basic structure? Now, I will say that one of the mistakes I used to make as a rookie darshan is that I would get so into the research process. I would learn all these amazing commentaries, and I would want to bring them all to the conversation. And again, that's one of the really fun parts of the learning that goes into creating a Devar Torah. but I learned that it actually takes away from the effectiveness. So it's hard to do. It's kind of like anybody who's ever edited your own paper, and you just feel so attached to certain parts, but there's a page limit or a word limit and you just have to cut it. So be a little ruthless with yourself, with the comfort of knowing that Torah that entered into your mind, in your heart, helped you prepare for this moment, and may in fact become relevant and be worth sharing at a future point in time. But really, really focus what you decide to bring out to your community, your listeners, your Torah followers, rather than bringing everything. Roberta.
So Jenny, when you are actually starting to work on a devar, do you already have an idea of your koshi, or do you do lots of research? And I mean, sometimes you might, and then sometimes you do research. Oh, wait a minute, this one's better, or something like that. I mean,
yes. Okay, great. Wonderful question. And I didn't talk about this at all. So what I hear you asking, Roberta, is what is my process? How do I start?
Right.
And the truth is I have a couple of different ways that I start. I will tell you that when I was younger and getting started with this, and I felt less secure, I was really worried about coming up with something very smart. And so I would usually begin with the commentaries. I would start reading books of commentaries that I had, things that other smart people had said. I would start with the Eitz Chaim, our Chumash, and read all of the commentaries on the verses and figure out what I thought was really interesting. I still do that sometimes, but more than anything, as I begin now at this stage of my life, is I begin with the Torah portion and I read it again, and I listen deeply for what calls out to me. And the reason that I do that, first of all, I have a lot more confidence now that in my own voice and my own intuitive wisdom, I have confidence that I won't come up empty-handed, that something will draw my attention in. And I have confidence that the thing that draws my attention in this moment, the thing that tugs at my heart most powerfully, is the thing that I will share with the kind of enthusiasm that will engage other people as well. But all of you who have lived as many years as I have, or more, you get credit for the more. You know what I'm talking about in terms of that developmental path. So it may be that you're like, a more senior person, but you're really new at giving a Devar Torah. And so I would say be really compassionate with yourself. Maybe you start with something, you get the inspiration from having read something really clearly that somebody else wrote or somebody else said, because you may not be a beginner at life, but you're a beginner at sharing Torah. But also open up the possibility that you could read the Torah portion and just see what draws your attention. Just see how it speaks to you, and start there. Does that make sense, Roberta?
It does. And I guess I just want to say, when you do a Devar Torah, it's not essential. I mean, it's amazing if you can, but it's not essential that you come up with a totally new idea. Right? Because I think that may be something that like hinders people, or makes them nervous, because like, I need to be, brilliant, that new thing. It's just maybe looking at something in a little different way, or something that you didn't realize before and you see it then. So.
Amen. Such an important point. And in fact, one of the things that I do as part of my ritual when I start working on a Devar Torah is I remind myself, as I open the first book, of a line from Ecclesiastes, Kohelet. There is nothing new under the sun. There's nothing new under the sun. And the truth is that Judaism, and I imagine this is probably true about all religious traditions, but I can speak most authentically about Judaism, is really a ritualized system of reminders of what we need to learn and relearn over and over again. And so even if what I end up sharing is something you already know, chances are, because you're human and I'm human, we have forgotten it. And it's worthy to be reminded in a new way in this moment, through your voice, Roberta, as it's refracted through your experience. So this is the thing, we're just all humans, and we often need to keep learning and relearning the same thing, maybe just as you said, in a slightly different way, through somebody else's experience or story or voice. And that's beautiful. Other questions? Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to close that. Oh, that didn't stop the share. Okay, there we go. That did. And I'm going to pull up another text, and we're going to work through this essay. So as I said, this is like still, even though this was published in 1993, this is still the best essay I ever read on how to create a Devar Torah. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. All right, can everyone see? Another thumbs up. Okay, good. So this comes from a book, a collection of essays by Rabbi Richard Israel. Rabbi Israel, I never got to meet him personally, but he wrote a number of books, including one book called The Kosher Pig. The Kosher Pig. It's a funny title. It's an easy one to remember. And this is his essay from The Kosher Pig. The Kosher Pig is a book of a collection of musings on how to be Jewish in the modern world, how to embrace tradition and the beauties of our inheritance as modern Jews. And I sort of always kind of felt very strongly identified with this author, Richard Israel. He started at Hebrew Union College, which is where Eric and I went to rabbinical school. He ended up taking a year to study at an Orthodox yeshiva, as we did at a time when Reform Jews didn't do that sort of thing. And then he went on to have most of his rabbinate in the Hillel world. He worked at UCLA and then later at Yale. So he was an out-of-the-box kind of rabbi, and I feel myself to be an out-of-the-box kind of rabbi. So I always felt very identified with him. In any case, that's a little bit of background. And so we're now going to take a look at what he said. So I'm going to read, and then I'll just kind of break it down. And as we go, feel free to interrupt at any point in time, ask your questions, and we'll go from there. All right. So he says, I'm not sure how much can be taught about giving a Devar Torah. Some rabbis who have been at it for years have never learned how. And we all know innocents who just jump in and come up with pearls. Maybe it comes with the genes, but I'm going to assume, at least on a provisional basis, that it is possible to teach people something about how to address a holy congregation in such a way that Torah is communicated. You may never become a great Torah teacher, but you don't need to know everything to teach something. Besides, teaching is the best way to learn. And I like all of these things, as we get started. Sometimes we feel like we have to be an expert in order to teach something. And when it comes to Torah, you don't. And it is really the most amazing way to learn is to share with others. All right, so what he's going to give you here are a couple of different ways, a couple of different metaphors or analogies for how we think about a Devar Torah. And I think they're super, Super helpful. Okay, your Devar Torah will almost inevitably fall into some rather specific categories or combinations of a couple of them. So the first one he's going to offer is, oh, hey, Jim, I'm so glad you're here. The microscope. So from close up, you look at very small fragments of a text in great detail and hope that as you magnify the specks, you will discover whole worlds within them. You have to be sure to pick up your specks with care, but you will know that you have some nice ones if the commentators are as interested in them as you are. If they aren't, chances are you should forget it too. Okay, so an example. Take the first word of Genesis, or better yet, the first word of Leviticus. So in Genesis, it's Breshit, in the beginning, right? Which of course doesn't exactly mean in the beginning. Or he says even better in Leviticus, Vayikra, and he called is a very confusing, ambiguous word. And describe how a series of biblical commentators have treated that word, what problem it represented for them, and what generalizations can be made about their resolutions. Okay, that's number one. And we often do this on Shabbat morning. We zero in on one word or one phrase or one interesting punctuation mark. That's a good example of a microscope. And again, if you start to delve in and see that there are many commentators, Rashi, Rambam, all these people had things to say, you're onto something. If you zero in on something that you think is like really curious and you cannot find a single commentator, you should probably move on. Okay, it's back to there's nothing new under the sun. All right, the second symbol that he uses is the airplane. So you observe a text from the distance, survey the panorama, take note of interesting details, and then as you descend, make observations on why the trip was worthwhile in the first place and how to appropriate what you have just observed for your more earthbound existence. The airplane is especially suitable for those Torah readings that deal with ritual details at great length. So for example, let's just say you're doing the Torah reading, I don't know, in Leviticus that focuses on all of these sacrificial offerings for Rosh Chodesh. It is possible within those sacrificial offerings that you might find one thing that gets you really excited, but maybe not. So you might want to take the airplane approach to that section which describes the sacrifices. And he's going to give another example here. After describing, which we just saw in this week's Torah portion, this past week, after describing the architecture of the Mishkan, that tabernacle that we carried with us in the wilderness, and its role in the lives of people, you might want to discuss the role of Minutia in the building of a religious life. As the French say, God is to be found in the details, okay? So maybe you use that just to talk about why details are so important. That's an example of the airplane view. Here's another example. A discussion of the Mishkan often suggests an evaluation of the difference between a Judaism that is fixed in one place, Jerusalem and the temple, and the portable Judaism of the Mishkan that can be carried about wherever we go. So that's an example of, again, you're taking that bird's eye airplane view of a section of the Torah, especially one that is highly, highly detailed. Questions so far about the microscope and the airplane? Okay, you're with me. Love it. The next one is the diving board. This one begins with an idea from the text, takes a big jump, and carries it into another issue of greater interest to you. So here are some examples. If the text deals with the furniture in the Mishkan, you can talk about the history of the artifacts used in the synagogue. Or if the text devotes a lot of attention to the dress of the priest, you can discuss Jewish traditions about dress and articles of clothing, like the significance of the talit, the kippah, special hats Jews were required to wear in the Middle Ages, or the self-imposed restrictions that Jewish communities once placed on fancy clothing. If the text contains long lists of names, right? We have these genealogies, especially that show up in the book of Genesis. They show up again in Numbers and Deuteronomy. You can present a history of the origins of some characteristic Jewish names, including the names of some of the people who will be present when you speak. If you are new at giving a Devar Torah, the thematic approaches represented by the airplane and the diving board may be the easiest for you to handle. Unless you are basing yourself on a traditional commentator, stay away from forms like Microscope or Puzzle. We're going to talk about Puzzle in a second, until you know enough Hebrew to be able to distinguish between a real nuance in the text and a mere idiosyncrasy of translation. Okay, so again, just to emphasize what he's saying, sometimes, again, if you're new and Hebrew is still a learning edge for you, the diving board or the airplane might be a stronger approach where you feel you can speak more authoritatively. And this is great. I had a friend who's a Jewish professional, but not a rabbi, and she's preparing, she was going to give a Devar Torah in her congregation in a couple of weeks. And she texted me and she said, my Torah portion has to do with the way that the priest is dressed. And I want to talk about appearances and how, even though this particular section of the Torah seems to focus on appearances, we're really a people that focuses on the sense of listening. So we're less about visuals. This is a place where visual kind of shows up in focus, but we're really more a tradition that focuses on hearing and listening. So that's sort of an example of where you kind of take a jump and you go somewhere else with your teaching. Make sense? All right. The Snuff Box. This is where Rabbi Israel shows his age. I'm like, I think if this group were much younger than me, they would know what a snuff box is, but you all do. All right. This is a less respectable version of the diving board. A visiting Maggid or preacher used to go from one community to the next. Just before he began his only sermon, his snuff box would drop out of sight. Where is it? He would ask loudly. It has vanished, swallowed up the way the earth swallowed up Korach and his company, which reminds me of an important thought about Korach. All right, it's a little bit, you've got your shtick and you sort of stick with it. Inventing a non-existent relationship between the text and a talk you would like to give is a technique generated by desperation. If you have just looked at the Parsha for the first time, in the morning you have to speak, and you have discovered that there isn't any good commentary on the text, then you are in deep trouble and may have to bail yourself out. But even then, the snuff box approach is definitely shabby. When you are finished speaking, your listeners have the right to expect that they will know at least some small new thing about the Torah they didn't know before. The snuff box rarely provides that. You may be sufficiently stuck that you have no alternative, but this is not a method of which you should be particularly proud. Occasionally, you will have an idea that can legitimately be attached to a number of texts. If, for example, you want to talk about the significance of miracles and have a talk in mind, you can probably hang it on several parshiot where miracles are found. Such a Devar Torah should not be considered a snuff box. All right, I like that. Okay, the biblical personality. Dealing with the narrative portions of the Torah, it's possible to analyze the characters of biblical figures and the events of their lives in ways that will shed some light on our own. Some of the standard subjects in this category include Jacob and Esau, or Joseph and his brothers, and the problems of sibling rivalry and preferred children, or Sarah and Hagar and the jealous wife. Lewis Ginsburg's Legends of the Jews, which is a classic, great reference text, which we have in our library, can often be of great assistance in supplementing your sense of a biblical character. Originally published in 6 volumes, it is also condensed into one thick paperback, A Certain People of the Book by Maurice Samuel, and that can be helpful in this area. Okay, so that's the biblical personality. Any questions about that? That's another great one, especially in Genesis, but also as it relates to Moses and Aaron and Miriam and some of the other foremothers and forefathers with which we have like a deeper sense of their human narrative. All right, the puzzle. People love to solve puzzles. If there is a classic form for the Devar Torah, this is it. You present several apparently discrepant facts or texts, and then explain how the contradictions aren't contradictions at all, but instead point to a deeper meaning that was not obvious at first. And Rabbi Eric and I did this yesterday with the Devar Torah. So there was one verse having to do with how we describe the way that the angels, these Kruvim, sat on top of the ark. And then we see a reference to a different idea of how the angels were oriented on the ark in a later text. And then we bring a text, one more text, that allows us to perhaps harmonize what appears to be a contradiction with our own creative spin. So we do this a lot. So for example, here are some examples that Rabbi Israel offers. Light was created on the first day of creation, right? We know this from all of our basic understanding of Genesis. First day, let there be light, and there was light. But the sun and the moon were not created until the fourth day. So where did the original light come from? Okay, Rashi has an answer. In fact, he has several answers, and so does contemporary physics. Can one derive an authentic Jewish response to the creationism controversy from these texts? This is another great example of a puzzle. Why is the story of the mission to find Isaac a wife repeated 4 times, each with slight differences? That's a very literary example of how we use a puzzle. We see this verse, this verse, this verse. What's different about each one? How can we harmonize them in some way, even though they appear to us to be unnecessarily repetitive or have some inconsistencies? Here's another example. The Torah tells us that we are not permitted to eat leaven on Passover because the people of Israel did not have enough time to allow their bread to rise as they hurried out of Egypt. We all know this basic teaching from the Seder. Not enough time to allow the bread to rise, so that's why we eat matzah. But they did have leaven in their bread. Why should we not have been told simply to bake our leavened Passover bread quickly before it has time to rise? That would have been a closer approximation to this important incident in our history. Or consider the riddle of the red heifer, which shows up in Numbers 19, whose ashes are used to purify the people who are impure, but make impure the priests who do the purifying. Okay, so just to make sure everybody gets this. So the priests have to find this, who are pure, presumably, have to find this pure red heifer to help people who are impure. And in the process of doing the ritual, they become impure, okay? That's a really interesting question. It seems like it's a puzzle. How might we figure that out? Okay. Nechama Leibowitz, in her volumes compiled as Studies in the Weekly Sidra, and she's an amazing teacher who has a literary approach to Torah, specifically focuses on ancient rabbinic medieval rabbinic commentaries like Rashi, Ramban, and we have her collection translated into English in our library as well. She never lets her readers off easily, so they still have quite a bit of work to do even after reading her material. But she brings a great deal of interesting rabbinic literature that is otherwise not available in English to bear on the questions she considers. The truth is now there's a lot more out in translation, but for a long time, Nechama Leibowitz was really a shining star in terms of bringing together materials that might have been inaccessible to English speakers. All right, classical Jewish literature loved the puzzle technique, which is in more elaborate form known as pilpul, literally pepper. These days, except in very specialized communities, one has to be careful not to get as carried away by it as our forefathers sometimes were. The number of contradictory facts that a contemporary Jew, even a smart one, can carry is rather limited. Don't build too clever a structure or it will fall apart and you will lose everyone. So again, just a reminder, less is more. Puzzles are good, but one puzzle, one very specific puzzle. Okay. Then any questions about the puzzle? Okay. The historian. Historical insights can sometimes open up a text in an exciting way. Even if you don't draw any deep morals, people are frequently delighted and enriched when they see a text in its historical setting. All right, so just as an example, in Song of Songs, it says, "My love, you are like a mare among Pharaoh's chariots." Buckets of ink have been used to describe the literary significance of that particular image. But Marvin Pope's commentary in the Anchor Bible, which is another great old commentary, deciphers this verse with ease. In the ancient Middle East, a particularly effective way to disrupt your enemy's chariot charge was to release a mare in heat, to run among the stallions pulling the chariots. This would throw the horses into pandemonium. The verse thus says simply that his beloved is profoundly exciting to him. Such an explanation may not carry a lot of spiritual weight, but people do like to learn such tidbits. All right, that's just an example. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead to his final piece here. Let's see. General issues. The Torah text is the common ground between you and your listeners. They assume that you will find something in that text that will be worth their while to hear. They are not expecting to learn about the political situation in Israel or what was in the New York Review of Books last week. Neither are they expecting you to explicate the Torah in a way which is not at all congruent with their sense of the tradition. They anticipate hearing some old ideas or familiar verses in a new way that will invigorate their Jewish lives. And this goes back to Roberta's point, like, what if you don't have some earth-shattering new insight? People don't need that. They don't necessarily expect that, okay? This means that you may not turn a text on its head by teaching, for example, that Esau or Amalek, for some interesting reason that you have just discovered, are splendid fellows. They're not. You may conclude that Joseph is selfish and that David has serious personal flaws. The Torah knows that and agrees with you. But you may not announce that Goliath is a misunderstood hero or that it is unreasonable to pick on poor Pharaoh, who was really a kind and gentle man. At least not unless you want to alienate your listeners. You must work, even if loosely, within the traditional understanding of the character and events of the Bible. A Dvar Torah, though it involves learning and challenge for the listener, also has a ritualistic quality. At some level, it must provide comfort. So sometimes people may not know this, but you know, when Eric and I give a Dvar Torah, the greeting is the opening part of that ritual. The sharing of the text that we're going to focus on is the next part of the ritual. The opening up to what people have shared about this text is the next part of the ritual. The invitation for others to add their opinion is the next part of the ritual. And the mic drop, or the way that we bring it home, is the final part of the ritual. I think it's interesting to think about that whole experience actually as a ritual. And what do we know about rituals? They're comforting because we repeat a certain kind of experience, which is always new because we're alive in this new moment, but it helps us remember a rhythm or a truth or a teaching that is already inside of us. Okay, I'm going to skip to here. Try not to get carried away by your conclusions, clever though they may be. You will generally be better served if you are modest about your claims. Ours is a very long and complex tradition, and there are very few propositions that can be stated flat out without lots of qualifications. Any sentence that starts by saying Judaism teaches that probably ought to make your listeners a little nervous. It is less pretentious and more honest to note that Rabbi X teaches that, or it is possible to interpret the text in the following manner. If you can speak from notes rather than from a text, your Dvar Torah will have freshness about it that cannot come from a read text. One option is an index card with no more than 5 separate entries on one line. But far better a read text than sloppiness or talking too long. So I will just emphasize this point. And I have learned this from Rabbi Eric, who is a master. It is so much better not to read your Devar Torah from a script that you have pre-prepared. Now, that takes a lot of confidence and courage, and you may not be ready for that just yet, but maybe hold that out as an aspirational goal. And if you're the type of person who can easily get sidetracked and distracted and maybe overtalk, then you're better off writing it out than going freestyle. Because some folks like that can end up just talking way too long. And then I love when he says, there's almost no such thing as a too short a Devar Torah. Don't even be afraid of one-liners or quick insights into 2 or 3 verses of the Parsha. If you can hang them all together, so much better. But if you can't, it's not too serious. For some reason, groups of 3 often work well and provide a certain reassuring symmetry. If you can make 3 points or give 3 examples, your Devar Torah will feel complete, regardless of how brief it is. Okay. And finally, a concluding caution. You should know about an important aspect of giving a Devar Torah that is quite unsettling. You can work very hard on a talk only to find that it falls on deaf ears. On the other hand, you can whip up a little something that morning and discover that it saves someone's soul. It is more than slightly bewildering to have a couple tell you 10 years later how this or that Devar Torah that you gave changed the direction of their lives, saved their marriage, or convinced their son to return to a Jewish life. You may not remember who they are or what it was you said, or even though you feel sure it couldn't have been what they heard. I mention this because teaching Torah is real responsibility. People are often quite open and vulnerable on a Shabbat morning. Once you send out your words, you never know just what use people will make of them. So be sure that they are the words you want to say. Giving a Devar Torah should not primarily serve to feed your own ego, although it may do that too. It should be an attempt to perform a holy act, and it is within that context that you should make your preparations. If you keep that in mind, you may find personal pleasure and growth among the byproducts of your efforts. You may even become a great Torah teacher. All right. So I love that he ends with that dose of humility. And I have found that to be true, both as a learner and a teacher. You never know how something you say is going to be that exact thing that somebody needed to hear. And also remember that what you say may be forgotten by everyone, including yourself. And that's okay too. Because when we say, for example, the blessing for Torah study, we say, thank you, God, for the mitzvah of engaging, busying ourselves with Torah. We don't thank God for grand insights because sometimes they come and sometimes they don't. We're not looking to master the Torah. None of us ever do. We're looking to engage with the Torah and to enable other people to meet themselves in the Torah. And so it's much more about process than product or destination. But every once in a while, you hit the target or you hit the bullseye for someone or for yourself, and that can be deeply, deeply satisfying. Okay, before I go on to some of my favorite online resources, I want to pause for questions or comments. Something that you heard that really felt new or resonated or is making you think. Linda.
Okay, I have a question. When you are focusing on whatever your koshi is, it's a person, it's an event, it's a whatever it is, you know, the Torah is so big and there's so many things that have happened before and will happen that I won't know and that actually matter to what I'm looking at, right? So how far in your study do you go to make sure you know all of the things that happened to that person before they got there? And like other people in the audience, they're going to know something that I don't know about that thing because it happened, 10 chapters ago, and then I'll look stupid. So like what do you do about that problem?
So great. Really easy to get paralyzed when you think, oh my gosh, not only can I not be an expert on the whole Torah, I don't even think I could be an expert on this little section. There are going to be people who remember things or make connections that I don't know. Yay. That is what we are doing. And that's why we study with each other. That very thing happened yesterday. Arthur Gordon had some comment about the Kruvim and made a connection to the Kruvim that were featured in the Garden of Eden. Eric and I didn't even remember that part, and we've read Genesis many, many times and taught about it. And we certainly didn't think about it in the context of the Devar Torah we were giving yesterday. Ellen Adelman threw her hand up and she's like, yeah, it's this chapter, this verse, That's fantastic. This is a very humbling task. This is a beautiful moment for us to right size ourselves and say, we're all just Jews learning Torah.
Okay.
And so whatever you have to offer, it's enough. You should be well prepared, do your homework and know that you cannot come in as a master of anything. And that's good. That means that other people can make contributions and enrich the conversation.
And I would actually think, Linda, what do I know? But I would think that if you say something that leads people to give that kind of insight or, increase the conversation, like kol hakavod to you, because you've done something that has given them a way to, to increase everybody's knowledge. And just, so
Great
we can
point.
if we can look at it that way, that can help us.
Yeah.
And I'm not just talking about insights necessarily. I'm just talking about the history of whatever it is, right? Because like say Moshe, well, something happened when he was a baby that made him do this, and I won't remember or know it. And that's so somebody else might.
You get to say, great point. And you know how that person feels? So smart and special. Okay, Janice.
Sometimes when I'm putting together a Devar Torah, I feel like I'm, in a groove and I'm getting some great points across. But then I'm like, oh my gosh, how do I finish this Devar Torah without going from, 60 to 0? I feel like there's an arc.
Yes. So if I understand correctly, you're asking, how do I bring things to a close? Or maybe a lot of things come up and I have lots of insights, or I'm able to garner some interesting insights from the people that I'm with, but it's hard to wrap it up. Is that what you're asking?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I think it's important for you to go in knowing what your final point is. And I think that's part of the preparatory work, and that's part of the ritual. It's kind of unsatisfying for people if it ends with wow, so many great ideas were shared here. Yay. It's much more satisfying when you say, thank you so much for all these fantastic insights and opinions. As we draw to a close, I just want to shine a light on this. And then you share your thing. And that's how we close. Or if you're not inviting participation, you can say something to the effect of, there's so many ways that we could possibly explain this particular thing, this koshi that you're addressing. But as we move forward into whatever comes next. The part that I want to hold close is blank.
You're always so articulate.
Thanks, Janice. All right, other questions? All right, we're going to do this really quick. I know our time is short, but I want to just, and I will, I'm going to put this in the chat, and then I'm going to send it, of course, to everyone. If you don't, well, okay, let me do one thing at a time. So first I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So there are fantastic online resources that literally didn't exist like 3 years ago. So this is a wonderful time to be a Torah learner in terms of having access to texts at your fingertips from your computer, having access to texts that are in English translation, and being able to access texts that from a much wider perspective. So when I was, early in rabbinical school, 25 years ago, I basically only had white men to learn from. I mean, pretty much. There were a couple of random women who had Torah commentaries and things like that, but very few. Now you can find queer Torah commentaries, Jews of color commentaries, all kinds of Torah commentary from all kinds of voices that just enrich our experience and our understanding. And I think that's also fantastic. Okay, so we have here Sefaria.org. This is an amazing, literally a Sefaria is a library, an incredible library of text. And they have a section within Sefaria called Sheets. And I could do a whole workshop just on how to work with Sefaria. But if you look at the part where it says Sheets, you'll see other people's Divrei Torah that they've come up with. And so you can just sort through what other people have put together and pieced together. And that can be really fun. The other is Hadar. Hadar is a yeshiva in New York that's egalitarian. I don't think they're officially associated with the conservative movement, but that's sort of the framework from which they come. And Hadar has wonderful online resources. So I go there all the time. Many of the teachers on their website are good friends and trusted colleagues. So I love how they approach Torah. Pardes is the yeshiva where Eric and I each spent a year studying in Israel. It's a pluralistic yeshiva, but all the teachers primarily are Orthodox. And but men and women learn together, and they have also a robust website that you can search by Parsha, by holiday, just so many rich resources on that website. And then two others are Reform Judaism has like a weekly Torah commentary where they ask different rabbis to share a teaching, and it's been going on now for probably 10 years. So there's a really nice collection, and they're all archived. So you can see, Parashat Truma, and you'll see 10 years of contributions. And then JTS, Jewish Theological Seminary, which is the conservative movement seminary, has a very similar online resource. Okay, so I am going to now, let's see if I can do this well. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to put into the chat that the first text I'm going to put on is the Kosher Pig essay. So just hang tight. So that is going into the chat right now. And then the second thing that I'm going to put in is that sheet that I just taught from that says the Devar Torah workshop, and we'll list all those resources. So you should see two documents in the chat. Now, I know on some people's devices, this can be very tricky. So if you do not see these documents, raise your hand. Oh,
You know, I see them, but it would be much easier
hard.
for me.
for me just
If-
to email them to you.
It would be much easier to email because I'm
Yeah.
not, I don't quite have the
No
skill or the
problem.
knowledge of how to get it from
Okay.
there.
Yes,
Thanks.
I'm gonna email to everybody. Just writing down everybody to make sure I got it. Okay, I got everybody. I will email you these two PDFs. Friends, thank you so much for your attention. I hope that this was enriching and illuminating and confidence building. Most importantly, yay, I got a thumbs up from Linda. And I'm excited to continue learning Torah with you and from you. And I want to close by saying, you can do this. We can all do this. And your voices are important. And
Can I
part of
ask-
being a Jew is knowing that you have something to contribute. Yes, Roberta.
Let me just ask a question.
Sure.
If like, you know, a parsha that has always interested you, like I know a parsha that interests me. It's the
Yes.
one where Moses strikes the rock, you
Yep.
know, he's not supposed to, and I've like really, is there a way to say when that parsha comes up, I would like to do one, or how is this going to sort of work? Are you going to say, we're going to be out of town now, think about these dates, or?
Yes. So the way that we do it currently is that we have certain away dates where we know we're going to be on vacation or at a conference or
Right,
something.
right.
And then somebody from the ritual committee, it's often Linda, but not always, will reach out to a group of people who have essentially raised their hand and said, I can't promise, but put me on the list. I'm open to it. And then when that call comes around, which is usually through an email, then you sign up. But you know, Shabbat morning is not the only time to give a Devar Torah. You can give a short Devar Torah at Minyan during the week, in which case just tell whoever's leading the Minyan, if it's Rabbi Eric or it's me, hey, I love this Parsha. I've always wanted to do a teaching on this particular Parsha. And that would be a different kind of Devar Torah. That would be like a 2 to 3 minute, what we call a vort, a word.
Right.
And then, of course, there are also sometimes Divrei Torah that come out if you're on a committee meeting, you know, if we're opening up our Chesed committee meeting, you know, some words of Torah to open up that meeting. So that's typically the way that we do it.
Okay.
We don't have it in such a way that, like, if you want to give a random Devar Torah, you
Right.
raise your hand. That's we consider that part of our job.
Okay. And then the question is, so Linda, how far in advance do you send out those dates so that people could have time to ruminate and, you know, whatever they need to do?
Right. And right before we are together this morning, I did send an email to Jenny so I can collect additional names of people who took the class that want to be on the list. But generally, we try to do it weeks ahead of time, like, you
Like a
know,
month.
6 weeks or more.
Okay.
And, you know, as we go through the year, more dates get added usually to the away dates. So right now I have 2 dates for the whole year, which I know it's not going to be. I know there will be more.
Right.
So
Well, maybe you can send those, you know.
and what I will say is February 26th, at this point, we don't have anybody and they will be away. And
What's the
we have
parsha?
filled in service leaders with people who are newly trained. And, you know, we haven't done anything about the Devar Torah and we have to do it now. I don't know if 2 weeks is enough for you, but we're going to
I don't know,
have
but
to
what's the
send the
parsha?
call out, and I
Yeah.
can add people, all of you, to the list if you want to be. And it's totally up to you whether you want to volunteer. I mean, generally, we don't need to hear from you unless you can do it. That's just extra emails no one needs. But
Right.
anyway, that's how
The
it works.
Parsha, Roberta, the Parsha is Vayakel. And
Okay.
it's also a special Torah portion. We read a special
maf
maf
here.
here
Right.
is Shekalim,
Oh,
because we're getting ready for Purim,
mhm.
and that always comes up before Purim. So lots of possibilities. It's also Shabbat Mavarchim, which means we're going to announce the new month. In this case, it'll be announcing the new month of Adar 2. So you could talk about Rosh Chodesh. I mean, there's lots of jumping off points, lots of diving boards. All right, folks. So great to be together. Linda, thank you for your leadership, for helping continue to make it possible for other people to share their Torah. I believe in all of you. And I'm also I will follow up with an email, but I'm also happy if anybody says, you know what, I'm going to do it. Don't feel that you need to go it alone. Meet with Rabbi Eric. We're here to help you shape what a Devar Torah that will ultimately be the most effective Devar Torah. And this is, it is both, a skill that one can learn over time. And some people have just a special gift with it. I don't think that I have a special gift. I think I've more taken it on as a skill, but everybody can get better. All right, everyone. Shavua Tov. Have a great week.
This was
Thank
great.
you so much. Thank
Good.
you. Take
Bye,
care.
everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you
Great
very
seeing
much.
everyone.
Bye-bye. Good to see everybody again.
You too.